The first ketchup contained no tomatoes at all. For centuries, the sauce we now squeeze onto fries was made from fermented fish guts in Southeast Asia, then reinvented in England around 1690 using mushrooms, anchovies, and even walnuts. Tomatoes didn't enter a single recipe until 1812, and sugar wasn't dominant until the 1900s. One salty, unglamorous condiment traveled 3 continents and shed its identity completely. So how did a fermented fish brine become the world's most recognizable red sauce? The word ketchup describes a taste and an idea that predate tomatoes by more than 1,000 years. The story begins in China around 300 BC, where coastal cooks were already packing fish into salt and waiting for time to do its work. Whatever you picture when you hear the word today, that image is barely 3 centuries old. And that something else was not English at all. The name printed on billions of bottles was borrowed from a language most ketchup buyers have never heard spoken. In the Hokkien or Minnan dialect of southern China, the word was ki tsiap, sometimes written kaitsiap. It did not mean a sweet fruit sauce. It meant fermented fish brine, the sharp, salty liquid that dripped out of the barrels. Linguists tracing the term note that ki referred to preserved fish and tsiap to sauce or juice, so the word literally meant the liquid squeezed from pickled fish, a name that describes a process rather than a flavor. That brine, not the fish, was the prize. Made along the coast of Fujian and across Southeast Asia, the sauce was the byproduct that mattered most. Cooks let fish break down in salt for months, and the flesh itself was almost incidental. What they wanted was the liquid, dark and pungent, capable of turning a bland bowl of rice or noodles into something savory. That intense, umami-rich brine was the original ketchup, and it tasted nothing like ketchup does now. The fermentation often ran 6 to 12 months, and the ratio was punishing. Roughly 1 part salt to 3 parts fish, enough to halt rot while enzymes and bacteria slowly dissolved the flesh into liquid. In fishing villages around the port of Amoy, modern Xiamen, entire households kept these barrels working year-round, drawing off the brine as a daily seasoning, much as later Europeans would keep a crock of vinegar. That intensity is exactly what caught the attention of foreign sailors passing through. In the 17th century, Dutch and English trade routes ran straight through Indonesia and Malaysia, and their crews kept encountering this liquid in port markets and kitchens. To palates raised on plain European cooking, the sauce was a revelation, a shortcut to flavor nothing at home could match. Traders started carrying it back on their ships. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, and its English rival, chartered in 1600, ran fleets through the Strait of Malacca and the trading hub of Batavia, modern Jakarta, where crews mingled with Chinese merchants who had carried their fermentation methods south for generations. An English sailor stepping off a ship in one of these harbors would have found the brine sold cheaply by the jar in crowded market stalls, a staple so ordinary to locals that no one thought it worth explaining to the wide-eyed foreigners buying it up. Carrying it back was possible because the sauce survived. Sailors valued fish brine precisely because it lasted through long voyages without spoiling, its heavy salt content acting as a natural shield against rot. A barrel loaded in a Southeast Asian harbor could still be good months later in a European kitchen. As the sauce moved, so did its name, and English tongues reshaped kaitsiap into ketchup and catsup, spellings that would compete for centuries. The voyage home from the East Indies could take 6 to 8 months around the Cape of Good Hope, a stretch during which fresh food rotted and beer soured, so a sauce that arrived intact was worth its weight. One of the earliest English mentions comes in 1690, when the writer and traveler records ketchup as an East Indian import, And by 1711, the naturalist Charles Lockyer wrote that the best ketchup came from Tonkin in northern Vietnam, advising readers that soy and this sauce were the two great commodities worth shipping home. But when those spellings reached England, they arrived without their main ingredient. England had no tradition of fermented fish sauce, no barrels of salted anchovy dripping in coastal towns. Cooks loved the deep, savory flavor they had tasted abroad, yet had no way to reproduce it. So they reached for whatever local ingredient could deliver that same dark, mouth-filling depth, and the first thing they grabbed was the mushroom. The mushroom turned out to be an inspired substitute. The first English ketchup recipes appear around the 1690s and early 1700s, many starting with mushrooms crushed, salted, and left to release their juices. Mushroom ketchup became a genuine British staple, a thin brown sauce splashed into stews, gravies, and pies. It carried that meaty, earthy richness the fish brine had promised, and for generations it was simply what ketchup meant in an English kitchen. Cooks favored the large flat-field mushroom, the horse mushroom, layering it with salt for a day or two before pressing out a dark liquor they boiled with cloves, mace, black pepper, and ginger. Jane Austen's own household kept a supply. Her sister Cassandra's family recipes and the accounts of the period show mushroom ketchup treated as an everyday cupboard essential, and Victorian chefs later reached for it so instinctively that it lingered as a secret ingredient in British cooking well into the 20th century. Yet mushrooms alone did not fully capture the original. To chase the missing note, cooks added anchovies, folding tiny salted fish back into the recipe to mimic the umami of the Asian source. In doing so, they had quietly circled back toward the fermented fish ancestor without knowing it. The sauce was a translation, an English attempt to speak a Southeast Asian flavor using a different vocabulary of ingredients. Once cooks realized ketchup was a method rather than a fixed recipe, the whole idea splintered into dozens of unrelated versions, each built around whatever savory ingredient a household favored. There was walnut ketchup, wildly popular in 18th century England, made from unripe green walnuts, pounded and steeped until the liquid turned nearly black. There was oyster ketchup and mushroom ketchup on the same pantry shelves. There was even ketchup made from mussels and from lemons. Walnut ketchup demanded green nuts picked in late June or early July before the shells hardened, then bruised and salted for a week or more until they wept a jet-black juice spiced with horseradish, shallots, and vinegar. Other cooks experimented with elderberries, with cucumbers, and even with beer boiled down with anchovies and mushrooms into a keeping sauce that could last a full year in a stoppered bottle. These competing versions were not hidden folk secrets. They appear openly in the great cookbooks of the era, including Hannah Glass's celebrated 1747 work, where ketchup is treated as a category with many acceptable forms. A cook of the time would not have blinked at being handed a walnut version one day and an oyster version the next. Ketchup meant a dark, salty, keeping sauce. What went into it was almost a matter of regional pride or personal taste. Glass's book, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, was a runaway bestseller, reprinted for nearly a century, and her recipe for a ketchup to keep 20 years called for stale beer, anchovies, mushrooms, and a battery of spices boiled down by half. Elizabeth Raffald's 1769 manual and later Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management in 1861 carried their own versions, each writer assuming their readers already knew that ketchup was a family of sauces rather than any single bottle. Into that crowded field, one recipe arrived that would eventually erase all the others. In 1812, in Philadelphia, a man named James Mees published a ketchup recipe built around the tomato. It was a small thing on the page, easy to overlook among the walnut and mushroom versions. But it introduced the ingredient that would come to define ketchup forever, the red fruit that most people today assume was there from the beginning. Mies was a physician and horticulturist, a founding member of scientific societies in Philadelphia, and his recipe appeared in a volume on domestic and agricultural improvements. He instructed cooks to take the pulp of 100 tomatoes, add a quart of brandy, mace, and pepper, and bottle the result, a formula still closer to the old brandy-laced English sauces than to anything on a supermarket shelf today. Mies himself did not even call them tomatoes. He referred to them as love apples, a name loaded with suspicion and folklore. Because the tomato belonged to the nightshade family, many people genuinely believed it might be poisonous, and eating one raw felt like a small act of daring. Choosing this distrusted fruit as the base of a sauce was an odd, almost reckless bet, and it did not immediately catch on. The name love apple came from the French pomme d'amour, and the fear was not entirely irrational, since the tomato's leaves and stems really do contain toxic alkaloids like other nightshades, such as belladonna. Popular legend holds that Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson dramatized the fruit's safety by eating a basket of tomatoes on the courthouse steps of Salem, New Jersey, around 1820, though whether that scene ever happened, the story itself shows how deeply the suspicion ran. The reason it struggled had less to do with fear and more to do with chemistry. Early tomato ketchup was a spoilage nightmare. Tomatoes are watery and only mildly acidic, and without enough acid and sugar to protect them, batches turned rapidly, fermenting and rotting in their bottles. Makers who wanted to sell tomato ketchup faced a product that seemed determined to go bad, and their solutions were, frankly, alarming. The tomato harvest itself was the trap. The fruit ripened in a short late summer window, flooding factories with more tomatoes than they could process in the days before refrigeration. Growers in the mid-Atlantic and Midwest delivered wagon loads that had to be turned into sauce almost overnight, and any batch left standing began to ferment within hours in the summer heat. To keep the sauce looking fresh and red, manufacturers reached for the chemistry cabinet. They stirred in coal tar dyes to boost the color, making a spoiling product still glow an appetizing red. They added sodium benzoate as a preservative to slow the decay. The tomato had given ketchup its future identity, but in these early decades, it also gave it a dirty secret, a sauce propped up by additives that had nothing to do with flavor. Those additives set up the central conflict of ketchup's entire history. Was this stuff safe food or a chemically doctored product dressed up to look wholesome? By the late 1800s, the question had teeth. Commercial ketchup often contained boric acid and even formaldehyde, chemicals used to fight the spoilage that plagued cheap production. Consumers were unknowingly eating preservatives that belonged in a laboratory, not a dinner table. The government chemist Harvey Washington Wiley, who ran the Bureau of Chemistry at the Department of Agriculture, made ketchup a special target of his investigations, testing sample after sample and publishing the results. In 1902, he recruited a group of young volunteers, nicknamed the Poison Squad, feeding them measured doses of common preservatives like borax and formaldehyde to document how sick they became. And cheap ketchup was among the foods that had made those chemicals routine. The reality behind some bottles was worse than the chemistry suggested. To cut costs, certain makers used rotten tomato scraps, the trimmings and spoiled leftovers from canneries, cooked down and disguised with dye and acid. The bright red color that promised freshness was frequently hiding the opposite. As reports spread in the early 1900s, public health concerns rose sharply, and ketchup became a symbol of an industry that could not be trusted to tell the truth about its own food. Inspectors found batches boiled from the skins, cores and green ends discarded during canning, material that would have been thrown away if not for the dye that hid it. When Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel The Jungle exposed the filth of the meatpacking plants, the public outrage spilled onto every processed food, and the murky bottles of adulterated ketchup fell squarely under the new suspicion. Into this atmosphere of suspicion stepped a man willing to make an unusual gamble. Henry J. Heinz believed that clean, preservative-free ketchup could win the market, but only if he could convince a nervous public to believe him. He had introduced his tomato ketchup back in 1876, and rather than hide his product behind opaque containers, he made a decision that doubled as an argument. He would let people see exactly what they were buying. Heinz had learned about spoilage the hard way. His first company, Heinz, Noble and Company, selling bottled horseradish in clear glass to prove it was free of turnip filler, had collapsed into bankruptcy in the panic of 1875. He rebuilt from that failure in Pittsburgh, and the lesson of transparency, once a horseradish gimmick, became the founding principle of everything he sold next. That decision took the form of clear glass. Heinz sold his ketchup in transparent bottles, a deliberate challenge to competitors whose murky sauces concealed dye and rot. If you could see straight through the glass to a clean, consistent red, you could trust it. The bottle itself became a promise of purity. And behind that glass, Heinz relied on natural preservation rather than the chemical crutches everyone else leaned on. His natural preservation came down to re-engineering the recipe itself. Heinz used ripe tomatoes and leaned hard on vinegar and sugar. The higher acidity prevented microbial growth, starving the bacteria and molds that ruined earlier batches. Increased sugar and salt did double duty, acting as preservatives while also shaping the taste. Where others fought spoilage with formaldehyde, Heinz fought it with acid and sweetness. His chemists worked to push the finished sauce below a pH of about 4.0, the acidity threshold where dangerous bacteria cannot survive, and they cooked the tomatoes longer to concentrate their natural sugars and pectin. The result was thicker and tangier than rival sauces, and it kept safely on a shelf without a drop of the artificial preservatives Wiley was warning against. That reformulation did something no one fully planned. It locked in the sweet, tangy flavor profile that remains standard today. The reason modern ketchup tastes the way it does, bright with vinegar and rounded with sugar, is not because someone decided that was the ideal flavor. It is because that particular balance was the recipe that stayed safe in the bottle. Preservation and taste fused into a single formula, and the world's palate followed. Heinz had built a purer product, and then history handed him a weapon to sell it. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act passed, giving the federal government power over what could go into American food. Heinz supported the ban on benzoate preservatives, the very additives his competitors depended on. His purity pitch, once just a marketing angle, suddenly carried the force of law, and the whole industry felt the shift. Heinz lobbied openly in Washington alongside Wiley, sending his own executives to testify that a safe ketchup needed no chemical preservatives at all, a stance that infuriated rival manufacturers who insisted benzoate was harmless. President Theodore Roosevelt signed the act into law on June 30, 1906, the same day he approved the Meat Inspection Act, and for Heinz the timing could hardly have been better. Competitors who had built their ketchup on additives now faced a reckoning. Forced to reformulate or vanish, many scrambled to match a standard Heinz had already been meeting for years. His early gamble on clean production paid off precisely when the rules changed, turning a moral stance into a commercial advantage. The messy, chemical-laden ketchup of the 1800s was being legislated out of existence, and one company was perfectly positioned to fill the gap. Filling that gap meant more than winning a safety argument. It meant standardizing a chaos of regional sauces into a single, unmistakable identity. Heinz took the sprawling family of ketchups, the walnut, the oyster, the mushroom, the lemon, and consolidated all of it into one idea: red, sweet tomato. By the early 1900s, Heinz had become a dominant American brand, and its version of ketchup was becoming the only version most people could name. The company's plant on the Allegheny River grew into a sprawling complex of dozens of buildings employing thousands of workers, and Heinz turned it into a tourist attraction, running free public tours that showed off spotless kitchens and white uniformed women filling gleaming bottles. That spectacle of cleanliness was itself a form of advertising, teaching visitors to associate the Heinz name with a purity their rivals could not display. The brand had already been teaching people to think in its terms. In 1896, Heinz launched the famous 57 varieties slogan, a number chosen more for its ring than its accuracy. It suggested abundance, a company overflowing with products, and it stamped the Heinz name onto the American imagination. As that name grew, the older ketchups shrank. Mushroom and walnut versions faded from common use, surviving only in old cookbooks and stubborn corners of Britain. Heinz later admitted he already sold more than 60 products when he coined the phrase. Riding a New York elevated train, he saw an ad for 21 styles of shoes and decided a memorable number would sell better than an honest one, settling on 57 partly because he liked the digits. He plastered it on painted barns, on a giant electric sign in New York City with more than 1,000 bulbs, and on a pier at Atlantic City, until the number itself became shorthand for the brand. With the recipe and the brand settled, attention turned to the smallest details of the product itself. Even the bottle's behavior became engineered. Heinz ketchup famously exits the glass bottle at roughly 0.028 miles per hour, a pour so slow it borders on stubborn. That thickness is not an accident. It is a signal of quality, a sauce dense enough to cling rather than run, and the company leaned into it as part of the experience. The bottle even told you how to beat that slowness. The 57 embossed on the neck marks the exact spot to tap to coax the ketchup out, a piece of design folklore hiding in plain sight. Later, squeeze bottles revolutionized dispensing entirely, freeing ketchup from the ritual of tapping and waiting. Every stage of the pour, from the drag of the glass to the puff of the plastic, was a decision made on the consumer's behalf. Heinz introduced its plastic squeeze bottle in 1983, and in 2003 it flipped the whole design on its head with an upside-down bottle that rested on its cap, letting gravity keep the sauce waiting at the nozzle. That single change, paired with a no-drip valve, was credited with reversing a slump in sales, proof that even after a century, the physics of getting ketchup out of a container still moved the market. For all that engineering, the sauce's true ancestors never actually disappeared. They simply survived somewhere else. Fish sauce remains central to Southeast Asian cuisine, the direct descendant of the salted brine that started everything, still poured into pots from Vietnam to Thailand. The original ketchup never died. It just kept its old name in its old home, while the borrowed name wandered off and became something unrecognizable on the other side of the world. That lineage reaches into unexpected corners of the Western pantry, too. Worcestershire sauce descends from the same fermented fish tradition, its anchovy base a cousin to those Southeast Asian barrels. And mushroom ketchup, the great English staple, is still sold in Britain today, a quiet survivor from the era before tomatoes took over. The family tree is enormous, and modern tomato ketchup is only its loudest, most famous branch, which leaves us with a strange kind of triumph. One sauce lost its ingredients, its origin, and its meaning, and became a universal symbol anyway. Ketchup is now sold in over 140 countries, a red constant on tables that share almost nothing else. The name outlived every original recipe, surviving the fish, the mushrooms, the walnuts, all of it. In roughly 300 years, it traveled from fish brine to global tomato icon without ever pausing to explain itself. Ketchup forgot everything was. It abandoned its fish, its country, and its meaning, and the only thing it carried the whole way was a borrowed word. What we call ketchup is a survivor of endless reinvention, a sauce that won by refusing to stay the same. If this hidden history changed how you see the bottle in your fridge, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one.